From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Please join me in welcoming him this afternoon to speak about the Emperor of All Maladies, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. The plague began in one house. We don't know very much about what that house was. We don't know very much about even its first victims. But by the time it became the plague, as we know it, we know something began to happen that changed the trajectory of that illness. The plague began to become not just a mechanism by which we understand the human body or illness, but in fact a mechanism by which we understand culture and civilization and history of that time. The influenza epidemic of 1918, which swept around the world, again began in one house somewhere and had its patient zero. We don't know her name, we don't know his name. We can surmise some names from that. And yet, again, something mysterious begins to happen in around the middle of 1918. Influenza doesn't remain influenza. It becomes a mechanism by which we understand the culture of 1918. It becomes a mechanism by which we view the world. Illness has a capacity to do that. It affects human beings directly. It begins in one home, in one body. It occurs in one home, in one body. And then it becomes something quite different. It becomes a mechanism by which we see the whole world. And that brings me to cancer. The Scottish writer Gil Elliot, whose work I particularly admire, a writer of the war, a historian of the war, once asked us to perform a thought experiment. I'd like everyone in this audience to help me with this thought experiment as well. And the experiment is the following. He said, imagine for a second a world, a nation, that was made up of all the victims of war in human history. Every person every man, woman, and child who had died during any war in human history. Now, we know a little bit about the size and the shape and the contours of this nation. It has about 1 billion men and women in it. We know that the nation grew dramatically in the 1914, for instance, grew dramatically again in the 1930s and 1940s. And what's interesting is that many of us know members or citizens, as it were, of this nation. Our grandparents might have been citizens of this nation. Perhaps some of our parents were. Now, the thought experiment that began to occur to me as I began to write the book, this book, was imagine a nationhood of cancer. Imagine, much like Gil Elliot asks us to imagine a nationhood in which every past, present, and future patient with cancer, everyone who had ever died of cancer, came together to form a nation. What would the contours of that nationhood be like? What would its size be like? Who would be its citizens? What's amazing to me is I can actually visualize, even as I sit here and talk to you, I can visualize the citizens that I know in that nationhood. It's almost as if I can have a conversation with them. So I'd like you for a second to imagine this nationhood. In this year alone, about 7 million people were added to this nation. It has exceeded Gil Elliot's nation of 1 billion by several magnitudes over, and will do so in the future in a way that is surprising even to people whose lives have been directly touched by cancer. And here's what's important to me about that nationhood is that we talk about degrees of separation. Here's a nationhood where we have no degrees of separation. This is our nation. 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with cancer in the United States. 1 in 4 of us will die of cancer in the United States. So this becomes not someone else's problem, it becomes our problem. And so in writing this history, I began to visualize it not as someone else's history, but as our history, as my history. And that animates much of this book. Now, to me, the question that I started off early on in writing the book was, how does one put together then a story of this nationhood, as it were, when its citizenship is so enormous, when it spans and spreads so many different boundaries? How does one put together narratively speaking, as a writer, how does one put it together? And perhaps the crucial insight I had in all of this was one that stayed with me right through the book, which is you can only tell very big stories by telling very small stories. And so I tried to stick with this right through. So the entirety of the book, my book, can be imagined, and I like to imagine it, as a series of individual stories that are strung together and are pieced together. And in fact, again, speaking to an audience of readers and writers, what was most tricky about writing the book was not the content, but the way they're stitched together. The book entirely lives in its seams, as it were. If you take the seams away, the entire book would fall apart. But of course, in my case, the seam, the stitching, was very obvious because I was writing continuously about the same entity, the same nationhood, as it were, and looking at it over and over again from different angles, much like blind men and women looking at the elephant. So let me begin by telling you one of these stories. I'm going to read 2 or 3 sections from the book and then talk about the book in questions and answers. But let me begin by talking about the seminal story that begins the book, and that is the story of Sidney Farber. Sidney Farber was a pathologist, a doctor of the dead, as they were called, because his job was to diagnose diseases, not to treat them. In the 1940s, Sidney Farber became particularly interested in a variant of cancer which was uniformly lethal. Again, think of this for a second. This was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and it was an illness that carried a 100% mortality. It was a disease that typically affected young children, and every child would be brought home to the hospital, and as one medical magazine importantly noted, would be diagnosed, discussed, transfused, and then sent home to die, every child. Farber became interested in this partly because he was interested in hematology, the study of blood, but he was also interested because, unlike many other forms of cancer, leukemia, which is a cancer of the blood cells, cancer of white blood cells, could not be surgically removed. You can't go to a surgeon and say, take my leukemia away, because by its very nature, it's present all over the body. And so Farber began to wonder whether there were medicines that would specifically attack these cancer cells in the body, spare normal cells, and thereby allow him to create a chemotherapy. Of course, even the word didn't exist. Now, Sidney Farber was helped in his quest by an Indian-born chemist whose name was Yella Pragada Subbarao. Subbarao had come from Chennai, from Madras, from India, to travel to Boston, to the School of Tropical Health, where he studied tropical health. But anyone who's been to Boston knows there's nothing tropical about Boston. Yella didn't know this. He suffered through 2 or 3 winters, and he eventually found himself a job as a urinal cleaner. He cleaned urinals at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and then, through a series of connections, worked himself up until he was performing what he eventually would call autopsies on cells. Much like a pathologist would perform an autopsy, Subbarao began to open up cells and ask the question of what lives inside them. And in doing so, he began to discover these molecules of life, these various biochemicals that we find very familiar today, but Subbarao discovered them. Unfortunately, this was a time when it was unquestionable that he would not get tenure at Harvard. And so he went up to a pharmaceutical company called Letterly up north in New York, where he began to synthesize some of these biochemical molecules, these molecules of life from scratch. And during this process, he stumbled upon an antivitamin, an antifolic acid molecule, and he began to synthesize this in vast quantities. Now, shoot back to Sidney Farber in Boston. Sidney Farber had figured out, using other people's work, that in fact such a medicine, such an antifolic acid reagent, would be valuable in treating cancer. And so Sidney Farber wrote to Yella, who he knew from his time at Harvard, and he began to inject children with lymphoblastic leukemia with this medicine, and he documented the first remissions. These remissions would last for about 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and then the leukemia would fiercely come back and the children would die again. And that was it. That is the beginning of the story. And for me, the quest in writing my book began to become, well, how does one then find the story behind this thing that I knew about from journal articles? How does one uncover the first patient? I talked about the first patient with the plague, the first patient with influenza. Who was Sidney Farber's first patient? And I began to look around. I searched quite widely for this young boy. I knew it was a young boy. I only knew his initials. It was RS. He could have been Roberto Salinas, Richard Salisbury, any name. I was in Boston then, and I thought, well, the child died, but somehow some relative must live close by, so I began to send out emails. I became a fan of these genealogy websites. I would post on genealogy websites and ask the question, do you know any child who died in 1948 with lymphoblastic leukemia, was treated by Sidney Farber? But there was no response, absolutely nothing. So I became dejected, and I thought I would take a vacation. And so I traveled to my parents' house in India, and someone said to me, it was in the middle of my vacation, this was the winter of 2006, and someone said to me, you know, that Indian chemist who had discovered these antifolates, someone said, well, this chemist had essentially one major biographer who lived a few blocks away from my parents' house. So one winter evening in 2006, having nothing else to do, I said, well, maybe I'll go over and travel to this man's house and have a conversation with him, not expecting to have a conversation with him about anything else aside from these antifolic acid derivatives. And so I spoke for an hour. You know, it was a wintry evening in Delhi. The insects were buzzing outside, and the sun set, and it was very quiet. And I said, well, it's time to go home. And then as I was leaving, he said, you know, I had been to Sidney Farber's clinic in the 1960s, and I have a record of these patients that Farber was treating. Would I like this? So here I was, 6,000 miles away from Boston, and I was handed a picture of a child whose name was RS, and a twin, a child and his twin, RS and ES, from 1948, a clipping from that he had kept, this man had kept. And I found out that the child's name was Robert Sandler. That was RS. And having then traveled 6,000 miles, I went back to Boston, and in 15 minutes away from where I was doing all my work, I could then go to this child's house and look outside through the windows as if through the eyes of a child who had undergone. So he is, in some ways, our ancestor, an iconic figure in our history who had vanished. And one last small moment, you know, when you write, you always want to figure out something about that moment, about being there, about reporting from that site. I came back from that visit to Robert Sandler's house, and I had my own daughter was 3 years old then. So I came back home, and she said, well, what did you do? And I said, I went to visit this child's house. The child is no longer there. And she said, well, where does he live? And I opened a map, and I showed her where he lived. And she said, and I was curious to find out, well, if I were looking through a 3-year-old's eyes, what would I remember about where he lived? And she looked at it, she looked around, and I said to her that he lived across from a zoo. And instantly she was animated. So the idea that if you were a 3-year-old child and you lived across from the zoo, the only thing you would remember were the ostriches or the tigers was something that found its way into my book. And the only way that found its way into my book was, again, remembering to look through the eyes of a 3-year-old child at what the world would look like. It wouldn't look like hospitals. It wouldn't look like the big buildings of Boston. It would look like the ostriches and tigers. The story has a little epilogue, and the epilogue is perhaps more amazing, truth being stranger than fiction. The epilogue is that about a week after my book was published, maybe 10 days after the book was published, I got a phone call in my office. It was my editor, and she said, you know, you need to sit down. I was writing a grant or something, and she said, you need to sit down because this is an important phone call. And it was the twin brother on the phone. Now he had walked into a bookstore, never having read about my book, never having known my book. And my book is dedicated to Robert Sandler and to those who came before and after him. And he opened the book and found his own twin's name. And then he, through an amazing series of coincidences, found a mechanism to contact me and then talk to me about my book. So I often say to myself that, you know, there are so many different ways in which my book has come from one circle to another circle. The whole process of writing for me has been circular. I never seem to move forward. History seems to come up, pull me back like a tide. Let me read then 2 sections from the book, which I think are interesting, important. I try to read different sections in different places, partly because it reminds me about what I wrote, much of which I've now begun to forget. This is the story of Robert Sandler's descendants, as it were. And by that I mean, I told you about acute lymphoblastic leukemia being 100% fatal in 1945, 1948. Well, Sidney Farber opened a peculiar door as if through a latch. By adding this one medicine that Farber had worked on, by adding more medicines, by the 1960s, these remissions had been lengthened out to weeks and then months. And by 1968, about 60 to 70% of children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia were being cured, completely cured. So this was a disease that was uniformly fatal in 1950. Had Robert Sandler been born 18 years later, we can surmise that he would likely have lived out the same lifespan as his twin. But he was born, as it were, too early. So this is, therefore, the part I'm going to read is now my attempt to find not Robert Sandler, but the iconic survivor then of lymphoblastic leukemia, the first cohort of patients who now began to live without dying of this disease. And that too is an interesting story. I was looking again for this, to me, this iconic figure. Again, I couldn't find her anywhere. I asked men and women, the physicians in Boston and around the world actually, to recall back to their very first cohort of patients. And they had some news, but they never fully had, none of these channels eventually worked out. And I was looking one day on the web, and by this time I had become so programmed to know exactly, I could tell you by what date you were treated, what regimen, what variation of chemotherapy you would have received. It was like a mental algorithm that I had. And one day I was looking through the web, and I found a woman who had posted on the website saying, you know, I was treated in 1964. And I knew instantly from looking at her, I knew exactly, it was almost like her whole medical history could have been written out in front of my eyes because I was so immersed in this story. So this is me then contacting her and finding her. But the story of leukemia, the story of cancer, isn't the story of doctors who struggle and survive, moving from one institution to another. It's the story of patients who struggle and survive, moving from one embankment of illness to another. Resilience, inventiveness, and survivorship, qualities ascribed to great physicians, are reflected qualities, emanating first from those who struggle with illness and only then mirrored by those who treat them. If the history of medicine is told through the stories of doctors, it is because their contributions stand in place of the more substantive heroism of their patients. I said that all the children had relapsed and died, but this is not quite true. A few, a small handful, for mysterious reasons, never relapsed with leukemia. At the National Cancer Institute and a few other hospitals brave enough to try VAMP, the regimen was called VAMP, of all peculiar names, about 5% of the treated children finished their year-long journey. They remained in remission not just for weeks or months, but for years. They came back year after year and sat nervously in the waiting rooms at trial centers all around the nation. Their voices deepened, their hair grew back. Biopsy after biopsy was performed on the bone marrow, but there was no sign of cancer. On a summer afternoon, I drove through western Maine to the small town of Waterboro. Against the foggy, overcast sky, the landscape was spectacular, with ancient pine and birch forests tipping into crystalline lakes. On the far edge of town, I turned onto a dirt road leading away from the water. At the end of the road, surrounded by deep pine forests, was a tiny clapboard house. A 56-year-old woman in a blue t-shirt answered the door. It had taken me 17 months and innumerable phone calls, interviews, questions, and references to track her down. One afternoon, scouring the internet, I had found a lead. I remember dialing the number, excited beyond words, and waiting for the interminable rings before a woman answered. I had fixed up an appointment to meet her that week and driven rather recklessly to Maine to keep it. When I arrived, I realized I was 20 minutes early. The basement was flooded and the couch was growing mildew, so we sat outdoors in the shadow of the trees in a screen tent with deer flies and mosquitoes buzzing outside. So here I was all prepared to do this big interview, this woman take photographs, except I couldn't go into the house because everything was flooded. So we had to sit outside. The woman, Ella, I'll call her Ella, had collected a pile of medical records and photographs for me to look through, and as she handed them over, I sensed a shiver running through her body. As of even today, 45 years later, the memory haunts her viscerally. Ella was diagnosed with leukemia in June 1964, about 18 months after VAMP was first used at the National Cancer Institute. She was 11 years old. In the photographs taken before her diagnosis, she is a typical preteen with bangs and braces. In the photograph taken just months after, she is transformed. Bald, sheet white from anemia, and severely underweight, collapsed on a wheelchair. Ella was treated with VAMP. Her oncologist in Boston, having heard of the spectacular responses at the NCI, had rather bravely chosen to treat her off trial with this 4-drug regimen. It had seemed like a cataclysm. The high dose of vincristine is the V in the VAMP, had caused such severe collateral nerve damage that she was left with a permanent burning sensation in her legs and forefingers. Prednisone, that's the P in VAMP, made her delirious. The nurses, unable to deal with a strong-willed, deranged preteen wandering through the corridors of the hospital, screaming at night, restrained her by tying her arms with ropes to the bedposts. Confined to her bed, she often crouched in fetal position, her muscles wasting away, her neuropathy worsening. At 12 years of age, she became addicted to morphine, which was prescribed for her pain. And then she detoxed herself by sheer force of will, by, as she put it, lasting it out through the spasms of withdrawal. And yet, remarkably, the main thing she remembers is the feeling of being spared. I feel as if I slipped through, she told me, arranging the records back in her envelopes. She looked away as if to swat an imaginary fly, and I could see her eyes welling up with tears. She had met several other children with leukemia in the hospital wards. None had survived. I don't know why I deserved the illness in the first place, but then I don't know why I deserve to be cured. Leukemia is like that. It mystifies you. It changes your life. My mind briefly flashed back to the Chiribaya mummy, to Atossa, to Halstead's young woman awaiting her mastectomy. Sidney Farber never met Ella, but he encountered patients just like her, long-term survivors of VAMP. In 1964, the year that Ella began her chemotherapy, he brought a set of photographs of a few such patients to Washington as a sort of show and tell for Congress, living proof that medicines could cure cancer. The path was becoming increasingly clear to him. Cancer research needed an additional thrust, more money, more research, more publicity, and a directed trajectory towards a cure. His testimony before Congress thus acquired a nearly devotional, messianic fervor. After the photographs and his testimony, as one observer recalled, any further proof was anticlimactic and unnecessary. Farber was now ready to leap out from the realm of leukemia into the vastly more common real cancers. We're attempting to develop chemicals that might affect otherwise incurable tumors of the breast, the ovary, the uterus, the lung, the kidney, the intestine, and the highly malignant tumors of the skin, such as the black cancer or melanoma, he wrote. The cure of even one such solid cancer in adults, Farber knew, would singularly revolutionize oncology. It would provide the most concrete proof that this was a winnable war. We'll read one last section from the book. This is a section right at the end when I talk about the future. And I use, again, to come back to Gil Elliot, I use the idea of a thought experiment, which is to take something and carry it forward through time to figure out what might happen in the distant future. And as a kind of index case, I chose what might be really the very first case that's described in the book, and that is the case of Queen Atossa. Queen Atossa was a Persian queen. We think she had breast cancer. She is just a kind of side note in Herodotus' histories, but a very peculiar, important side note, because it turns out that Atossa discovers that she has a lump in her breast, as Herodotus puts it, and then somehow, poignantly, reminiscently for our times, she goes into hiding. Her first reaction is shame, and she hides her breast. And ultimately, there's a Greek slave. She was a Persian queen. She had a Greek slave named Democedes, who ultimately excises. She allows him to excise her malignant breast. Whether it's a tumor, whether it was an ulcer, we don't know. The word doesn't exist. And Herodotus spends only 3 lines in the histories talking about this case. But it turns out this case actually is the entire histories pivots on this little 3-line sentence, because once Atossa has been revived, she lives, as far as we know, Democedes, the Greek slave, begs her to allow him to go back to Greece. And the only way the slave can be returned back to Greece is if the Persian king will conquer Greece and therefore bring the entire kingdom to Greece, as it were. And so Atossa, Herodotus tells us, pleads with her husband to turn the face of the Persian war away from its eastern front in Scythia towards the Greek front. And that, of course, originates the early history of the West. The switch in the face of Persia and the switch in the face of the Greco-Persian War, which follows, really switches and turns the axis of the world. And so, amazingly, even though Herodotus dedicates 3 lines or 4 lines in the histories, it's the pivot. This single case is the pivot on which, to some extent, the histories turns. So I go back to her as a kind of index case and talk about her and walk her through time. So I'm going to read this last passage to walk her through time and give you a sense of the sweep of what we cover to some extent in the book. Recall Atossa, the Persian queen who likely had breast cancer in 500 BC. And now imagine her traveling through time, appearing and reappearing in one age after another. She is Cancer's Dorian Gray. As she moves through the arc of history, her tumor, frozen in stage and behavior, remains the same. Atossa's case allows us to recapitulate past advances in cancer therapy and to consider its distant future. How has her treatment and prognosis shifted in the last 4,000 years, and what happens to Atossa in the new millennium? First, picture back in time to Imhotep's clinic in Egypt in 2500 BC. Imhotep has a name for her illness, a hieroglyph that we cannot pronounce. This is the very first time we encounter cancer as any medical illness. He provides a diagnosis, and then he writes, "There is no treatment," closing the case. In 500 BC, in her own court, Atossa self-prescribes the most primitive version of a mastectomy, which is performed by her Greek slave. 200 years later, in Thrace, Hippocrates identifies her tumor as carcinos, thus giving her illness a name that will ring through its future. Galen, in 168 AD, hypothesized a universal cause, a systemic overdose of black bile, as he puts it, trapped melancholia boiling out as a tumor. 1,000 years flash by, we're moving through time. Atossa's entrapped black bile is purged from her body, yet the tumor keeps growing, relapsing, invading, and metastasizing. Medieval surgeons understand little about Atossa's disease, but they chisel away at her cancer with knives and scalpels. Some offer frog's bloods, lead plates, goat dung, holy water, crab paste, caustic chemicals as treatments. When Atossa reemerges in the 19th century, she encounters a new world of surgery. In Halstead's Baltimore clinic, this is William Halstead, the great surgeon, in 1890, Atossa's breast cancer is treated with the boldest and most definitive therapy thus far, radical mastectomy, with a large excision of the tumor and removal of the deep chest muscles and lymph nodes under her armpit and her collarbone. In the 1970s, new therapeutic strategies emerge. Atossa's surgery is followed by adjuvant combination chemotherapy to diminish the chance of a relapse. Her tumor tests positive for the estrogen receptor, and so tamoxifen, the anti-estrogen, is added to prevent a relapse. In 1986, her tumor is further discovered to be HER2 amplified. In addition to surgery, radiation, adjuvant chemotherapy, and tamoxifen, she's now treated with targeted therapy with a new drug then called Herceptin. It is impossible to enumerate the precise impact of these interventions on Atossa's survival because the shifting landscape of trials doesn't allow a direct comparison between her fate in 500 BC, for instance, and her fate in 1989. But surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, hormonal therapy, and targeted therapy have added likely anywhere between 17 and 30 years to her survival. Diagnosed at 40, say, she can be reasonably expected to celebrate her 60th birthday. In the mid-1990s, the management of Atossa's breast cancer takes another turn. Her diagnosis at an early age and her ancestry raise the question of whether she carries a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2, and so her genome is sequenced, and indeed a mutation is found. She enters an intensive screening program to detect the appearance of a tumor now in her unaffected breast. And now her 2 daughters are also tested. Found positive for BRCA1, they're offered either intensive screening or a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy, or even tamoxifen to prevent the development of breast cancer. For Atossa's daughters, the impact of screening and prophylaxis might be dramatic. A breast MRI might identify a small lump in one daughter. It might be found to be breast cancer and surgically removed in its early pre-invasive stage. The other daughter might choose to undergo the prophylactic bilateral mastectomy, excising her breasts preemptively so that she can live out her life free of breast cancer. Move Atossa into the future now. In 2050, she will arrive at her breast oncologist clinic with a thumb-sized flash drive containing the entire sequence of her cancer's genome, identifying every mutation in every gene. An algorithm might identify the pathways that are contributing to the growth and survival of her cancer, and therapies will be targeted against these pathways to prevent a relapse of tumor after surgery. She will begin one cocktail of drugs, expect to switch to a second one when her cancer mutates and becomes resistant, and switch again when her cancer mutates and becomes resistant again. She will likely take some form of medicine, whether to prevent, to cure, or to palliate her illness for the rest of her life. This, indubitably, is progress. But before we become too dazzled by Atossa's survival, it's worthwhile putting it into perspective. Give Atossa metastatic pancreatic cancer in 500 BC, and her prognosis is unlikely to have changed by a few months over 2,500 years. If Atossa develops gallbladder cancer that's not amenable to surgery, her survival changes only marginally over the centuries. Give Atossa CML, this kind of leukemia, or Hodgkin's disease, and her lifespan might have increased by 30, 40, or even 50 years. Part of the unpredictability about the trajectory of cancer in the future is that we don't even know the biological basis for this heterogeneity. We cannot fathom, for instance, what makes pancreatic cancer or gallbladder cancer so different from particular variants of leukemia or Atossa's breast cancer. What is certain, however, is that even the knowledge of this biology is unlikely to eradicate cancer fully from our lives and our bodies. As Richard Dole suggests, and as Atossa epitomizes, we might as well focus on prolonging life rather than eliminating death. This war on cancer might best be won, if this is what we mean by winning, by redefining victory itself. I'll stop here and I'd welcome any questions. Yes, sir.
Recently, there was an article in the Washington Post which raised some questions about testing for cancers after a certain age. I just wondered if you had any opinions on that subject.
So it depends on the kind of cancer. I'll give you a very thorny example that's come up recently and will come up in our lives, which is after a very, very long time, a massive trial was performed which asked the question whether smokers, heavy smokers with a long history of smoking, should be screened with CT scans, CAT scans, to detect early tumors and therefore eliminate them from their bodies. Now, you might think this is logical, and in fact, this is what the trial tried to prove. And in fact, if you do this in the appropriate setting, you actually save lives. Heavy smokers scanned by CAT scans, you can take the tumors away and you save lives. Now, here's a question. Your grandfather smoked 7 packs a day for 20 years and quit 10 years ago. Should he be screened? You smoked as a child or as an adult, let's say an adolescent, from 14 years to 17 years, quit, stopped again, and then started again. Should you be screened? Now, what happens as a result of this kind of paradigm is that every time you run a screening trial, there's a slippery slope, and you begin to slip down that slope. And it's a very complicated one because every time you're screened, you're getting radiation, and radiation comes with costs. So it tells you how complicated it is even to run the simplest trial. The most logical thing, CAT scans are good at detecting small tumors. You're a smoker, so you're high setup for having a small tumor. Maybe we can take it out. This simple question became and is going to become literally $1 billion question. If we took it to its logical limits, it would bust Medicare. Because how many people would you screen for how many cancers? So it's a reminder to us that we have to take these screening trials very, very carefully and to figure out what's the right population, who should we be screening, how much screening should be offered, and when should the screening stop. And we just know just a little bit. We know a little bit about mammograms and breast cancer. We know a little bit about CAT scans and lung cancer. The rest of it is completely unknown.
I haven't read the book yet, and maybe the book answers this question, but since you've studied the history of cancer, I have always thought that we actually have a lot more cancer now because we've polluted our air, our water, and pretty much our entire food supply. Is there more cancer now, or was it just hidden and not talked about?
So the answer is there is more cancer now than ever before. The predominant reason driving that is, as far as we can tell, the overall aging of the population. That what's driving the rise in cancer incidence and prevalence is in fact the overall aging of the population. Now, If there are pollutants in the food, in the water, in the air, they're certainly contributing, but that contribution is overwhelmed by the drive. I call cancer a disease that only emerges in the double negative when all the other killers are killed. So that's what's driving the incidence. Make no mistake, however, to assume that cancer is a disease that is that is only in the old age. If we just took young people, and by young I mean, this is a changing standard, by young I mean anyone under 60 who's dying of cancer in the United States, you still have hundreds of thousands of men and women, hundreds of thousands of men and women, the total being 600,000 if you take all comers, but still hundreds of thousands of men and women. So that's what's driving the incidence. Yes, sir.
My question was right to that point. What are the statistics on the age-adjusted incidence for all the cancers? Because some physicians have said we've got some alarming increases in childhood cancers, and we ought to be looking. I mean, it's of course vitally important to find cures. I have one relative who needs to be cured, who has had cancer, but he said the scary thing is that we're getting too many, and we ought to be looking at root causes on those. What's your answer to that?
So a couple of important points, and again, I go through them in the book, but we have to. These are very crucial points. The age-adjusted incidence of cancer is a very complicated thing, and the reason is, as we become better and better at diagnosing cancer, the age-adjusted incidence will rise only because we're becoming better at diagnosing it. So, for instance, the age-adjusted incidence of prostate cancer has gone up dramatically after the PSA test. The age-adjusted incidence of breast cancer has gone up dramatically after mammography, and that's because we're becoming better and better at diagnosing them. So what you really want to ask is, what is the age-adjusted mortality? How is that changing? And the answer is that, in fact, it's been decreasing. It has been decreasing for the past about 10 odd years. It increased dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s because of the long shadow of cigarette smoking, particularly in women. The men, the peak already had occurred. The women, the peak in women came later. And so that drove it up during the 80s. And about for the last 10 odd years, it's been declining. Mortality has been declining. Now, that is not only because of prevention of smoking. Treatment and screening have both played a role in it. So it is absolutely true that the decline has been present for about a decade or so. Yes, sir.
Hi. As I understand it, there's a general rule that 80% of physical health issues have a behavioral health component. There's a psychiatrist, psychologist who for 30 years has looked at that really in the context of family dynamics and stress leading to cancers. He's got a term, unity disease, which I can't explain right now, but do you see incidences of that stress from any source, especially family dynamics, can increase the probability of cancers?
I'm very resistant to this idea myself for several reasons, and I've gotten myself into enormous trouble for saying this, but I think it's correct. I think there is with cancer especially, the idea of blaming the victim is a very old idea, particularly in women's cancers. And to say to someone, the reason you have cancer is because you were stressed or depressed, essentially reinvents to me the medieval idea of blaming the victim. The woman with breast cancer already has enough on her plate. She doesn't need to be told that the reason she got cancer was because she was stressed or depressed. We've actually studied this somewhat. It would be useful to have a whiff of evidence, such as populations where there's a huge amount of systemic stress having higher rates of cancer. They would be useful to have a whiff of evidence from, for instance, large registries that follow people with depression, really chronic depression. And that evidence has just not been convincing. It has not been convincing. Now, it's absolutely true that your psyche, your mental state, has very much to do with the process by which you heal. But everyone's process is different. I know as many people with the most positive spirits who have died of cancer, and I know many, many people who have had the most negative attitude and who still survive. So.
Oh, it's very preliminary.
Yes, sir. Looking at, say, biliary cancer, stage 4, the liver and kidneys, do you believe that chemotherapy has the best chance of at least prolonging life? Would gene therapy come into play, or is it too late for that? And alternatives such as vitamins without getting too much antioxidant, or herbals like turmeric and other things, how much can that come into play to at least prolonging, if not curing, such an illness?
Well, we've talked a little bit about alternative medicine. I mean, in general, I think intelligent chemists and scientists have to be agnostic about alternative medicine. All our medicines were alternative until they became traditional. Our pharmacopoeia comes from plants primarily still today. That said, have there been enormous discoveries in cancer medicine, in treatment, that have come from this so-called alternative medicine world? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced yet. My only plea to every community, whether it be traditional or alternative medicine, is that we have to have the same metrics. Otherwise, our language begins to degenerate. We need to have a language that's common, and that is, we know how to run trials, we know how to judge metrics, and so my plea is, let's bring all of those. Now, in particular to gallbladder cancers, this has been a struggle for, I would say, decades now, and really nothing significant has worked. We need a completely different way of thinking about delivering medicines to gallbladder and pancreatic cancer. And you wouldn't be surprised that, you go outside, pancreatic cancer lies at the very front of all investigations, that from the National Cancer Institute right up to every single advocacy organization is saying, let's make an example, let's turn pancreatic cancer around. But thus far, not very much has worked.
And
surgery.
And liver and kidney.
Liver and kidney, yeah, similarly. Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a science writer for PNAS, so my question is really about your writing process.
Yeah.
So in some ways, your book is this epidemiological journey, and it's a very long one, and you talked about how
A very long one, yes.
And you talked about how the book lives in its themes. So I'm curious about whether you drew inspiration from other books to sort of build this narrative.
Yeah, so I can talk about my sort of antecedents. My antecedents there are many, but let me talk about a couple that are important. Richard Rhodes' Making of the Atomic Bomb was an important antecedent to my book. If you haven't read it, I think it's an amazing history. I was also particularly inspired by a series of books, but Rachel Carson's book. The way Rachel Carson's book came in to answer the question that must have been on everyone else's mind, but somehow no one was asking it. How does the environment affect our bodies? How is it affecting, how does our intervention affect nature? And it was a game changer. You didn't speak about the environment in the same way before and after Rachel Carson's book. So those were some of my sort of heroes, my antecedents. More contemporary ones include Michael Pollan's book, which I was very intrigued by. And then there were a whole series of books that also live, as I say, in their seams, and a series of essays. Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, and you'll see that threaded through the whole book. Yes?
When you read so much about how cancer impacts patients psychologically, through the diagnosis as well as into survivorship with distress and despair, why is it that we're not spending more time and money towards the psychological aspects of cancer?
I wish we were. Just to give you an outlay of what's happening, and this is your job. This is what we need to do. There are going to be global cuts across the National Cancer Institute budget this year. Let me give you a sense of numbers, and we'll finish with this maybe. Let me give you a sense of numbers. The NCI budget this year was $5 billion. The amount of money that was spent in the Middle Eastern wars in the last few years was $3 trillion. That is 1/600th of the NCI budget. For every $1 we gave to the NCI, we gave put $600 into this war. There will be 600,000 deaths of cancer this year alone. So absolutely, we would be spending more money across the board to the psychological, to the psychiatric, to rehabilitation, to new trials, to new medicines, and the total amount of money budgeted in Congress is $5 billion. So it seems to me that there's a disproportionality there, but you tell me. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.